And there we go. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Thrive. Today we have one of my spiritual mentors, Stomaji, also known as Stephen Parker, PsyD, psychologist living in, I don't know, I guess all over the world, but most of the time, I guess your headquarters would be in Minneapolis. Is that correct?
Yeah, and certainly for the last year.
Oh, yeah, I bet. During the pandemic, you probably didn't get a chance to travel around much.
Not at all.
Yeah. How was it being in Minneapolis during the whole pandemic, knowing that um, it sounds like a very different type of life compared to what you did before, where you were traveling, giving lectures, and teaching people meditation.
Definitely. I retired from my full time psychotherapy practice at the end of January 2017. And so when I'm home, I'm just a retired guy. And, my job is basically to learn to be a good spouse and make sure I get dinner on the table at 6 o'clock every night. Um, and I pursue my retirement. Second career has been to gradually become more of a neuroscientist. And I have been working with a consortium of international neuroscience researchers into meditation and consciousness from 17 or 18 countries um, as part of a research seminar that's coordinated through the university, Sapienza University in Rome. So gradually, I'm sort of schooling myself in neuroscience and neuroscience research strategies. I'm still really a beginner on the technical side of it, and my primary interest is mostly on the theoretical and methodological side. Um, and so that's really taken up a lot of my time. But actually, the whole atmosphere of living at home here in Minneapolis over the last year has been quite surreal. I mean, the effects of the pandemic notwithstanding, the suspension of any real sense of time and the sort of interesting emotional side effects of living in isolation so much um, from friends and family. That's been interesting enough to watch. But then on top of all of that, George Floyd was killed 10 blocks from my house.
Oh my God.
And there were a couple of nights in late May last year when my neighborhood was completely on fire.
Wow.
And there was a degree of traumatization that came with that, even though people didn't really bother the residential streets. I live very close to a major commercial street, and many businesses in that area were burned, including a gas station 150 meters from my back door, which could
Oh my
easily have
God.
blown us all to bits at any moment. And so it was quite an experience, and it's also been interesting as a longtime activist about social justice issues going all the way back into the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War to watch the conversation on racism proceed and on what society's responses to it should be. And I'm not very happy with the conversation the way it's going on a number of different fronts. I think the governmental responses in terms of how to work on police reform have been too minimal.
Hmm.
Um, at the same time, the responses made by people who put themselves across as progressives have been unbelievably naive and clueless. Um, our city council in Minneapolis are the ones basically who created this phrase defund the police, and in as a result of going to a rally in the days after Floyd was killed, and they didn't really have an idea what they were going to do at the time, and they really still don't. They have not been consulting with other cities that have had some success with reforming their policing. Um, And their only response to questions about how are you going to do this is, well, we're going to have a dialogue with the community. Well, as I'm sitting here in the middle of the neighborhood, as stores are being looted and people are running around with automatic weapons, I don't care about dialogue with the community. I mean, I really felt profoundly unsafe for about 3 hours. I mean, my baseline sense of safety in the world, the sort of existential frame of safety that allows you psychically to sort of prevent post-traumatic stress disorder, was fractured. And we need to have policing there, because there still are people running around who are not just experiencing a hard time, let's say, who really get a thrill out of hurting people. And we have to take that into account in all of these processes. So it's been a really interesting thing to watch. I moved into this neighborhood. I live in the central neighborhood of South Minneapolis years ago because I grew up in the suburbs. And as a therapist, I'm totally well aware of all of the things that went on in the suburbs behind closed doors. It was all secret. It was no less chaotic and weird than it is in the center of the city, but it was hidden away where nobody could see it. And it was all sort of plastered over with this wonderful veneer of normalcy. But what was his name? The American psychologist who lives in Mexico, it was Jerome Frank, who wrote The Pathology of Normalcy in the 1960s, all veneered over with this pathology of normalcy. And so I said, I'm going to live in the city or I'm going to live in the wilderness, nowhere in between. So I decided to move to the city, thinking naively, as it turns out, that, as we sort of encounter each other day to day in running our lives, that I would get to know people who are very different from me. And that doesn't happen. Even in the city, it doesn't happen that much. If you look at churches, for example, they're either black or white. You can count on the fingers of two hands the number of church congregations in the United States that manage to really mix African American and white people, because the church has very different functions in both communities. So I think this question of sort of how we get together and get to know each other is a much deeper one than just a political contemplation of what to do about racism. I think, frankly, as a neuroscientist, it goes back to the way in which our interpersonal neurobiology puts us in a position to be choosing, and this is on an evolutionary scale. I'm not talking about something that happens in one lifetime. Choose an in-group and an out-group. Choose the people who are the friends and family who can nurture our vulnerable children during their extraordinarily long childhood, during which time they're incredibly vulnerable to death. And how we define the enemies that we need to defend against. And I think that's part of what we're up against here. It's not just about the phenomenon of racism. It's also our biological selection of who is us and who is not us. And that sort of thing is not going to change quickly. Those kinds of processes that are woven into our neurobiology are as much homeostatic as any biological system. They really work to remain as stable as possible, and they change kind of grudgingly, with a lot of effort. And that's why it takes so long. It's not about people being lazy or ignorant, although those things also happen. It really is also about how slowly our nervous system allows it to soak in that these people are okay. So I think, and it's hardest with African American people because their difference from white people is so obvious as a result of color. You see the same thing happens in India. There's a big, and Indians don't like it when I talk about this, but there's a big thing in India about skin color. And there is a lot of discrimination that happens on the basis of whether one's skin is dark or light. And the trade in skin whiteners is still very active in India. So, I mean, this isn't something that's just an American problem or just a European problem. Uh, it's a problem just about everywhere. I mean, even in Africa, skin color becomes a big deal. Um, and a lot of sort of decisions about caste and class get made on the basis of those visual judgments on who is us and who's not us. So um, I just want people to pay attention to the depth of what's going on and to have a little compassion for each other about how long it takes these processes of change to happen. And that's coming from somebody who was always attracted to the most different person in the room, even as a kid. When I first got into school in the American Midwest in South Dakota, um, where obviously white people are a vast majority, um, I was drawn to the American Indian kid and the black kid in the class to play with. And I brought them home to play with me. And all my white neighbors were questioning my parents about what's wrong with that boy. Um, so, I mean, even for someone who's inclined to be attracted to people who are different, it still takes a long time. And that's really frustrating. And I think a lot of people find it um, disillusioning and disheartening. But I think adding in this piece about the neuroscientific basis for a part of how we make these decisions allows us a little room to take some time to get used to each other. Well, that's probably way into the weeds for the beginning of an interview, but
Well, I find myself fascinated with what you were talking about. I didn't realize how close you were to all the dangers that occurred there. I didn't. I don't. I saw it on TV. I saw it multiple times, and and sometimes all these things are so politicized that it's hard to get a
right.
good sense of what's actually going on and what is the right decision to make, because even normal nuanced discussion about the problem becomes so politicized that it's hard to find a way to make the immediate danger situations work. And then let's not even talk about what medium term or long term ways of managing is. And then as you were talking about the more let's say quote unquote simplified or natural or way to address this issue, where basically through our childhood what we consider in group and out group, and I say quote unquote simplified because it's so complex, right? Like we can have, and it has happened through generations and hundreds of years ago, where you would have where white people would have black people taking care of their children for throughout their childhood, and still that doesn't mean it's in group, right? It's not just the fact that you are around all potential different type, and I say quote unquote different type really because it's just whatever it is that we use our mind to differentiate, whether it is race or socioeconomic status of ways of behavior politically or ways of uh, eating habits, etc.
Yeah.
Our mind is naturally inclined to separate and discriminate and or discern between one thing and the other, so that we can walk through the world, and then we attach emotions of hierarchy to them that don't really necessarily make sense. And yeah, I see what you're saying, and I find myself, okay, how do I for myself promote this in the best way possible?
Well, and I think the way that we promote it in the best way possible is to shut up and listen most of the time. um, and I don't mean that just facetiously, because The thing that helps you to change your nervous system in the fastest and most efficient way is mindful awareness, starting from awareness of your breath. And that stimulates the medial prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for integrating everything else. So that's how those habitual patterns gradually end up getting changed in the most efficient way possible. And we know from the research on consciousness that part of what happens if you make that a practice in your life over the long term is that you develop a capacity for open-heartedness, compassion, and understanding the inner experience of another over time that are, I mean, in addition to being wonderful qualities on their face, are also really the genuine signs of spiritual progress in people. Um, and nothing taught me more about this than my career as a psychotherapist. There was one period during my doctoral studies when I was so busy that I just didn't have much time for a formal sitting practice of meditation. So I decided to take my mantra meditation into my workday and to practice using the mantra that I use for my meditation in between sentences as I talk to people.
Hmm.
Now, this was a really interesting experiment, more than I ever thought it could be, because in the process of doing that, I became so much more quiet. I said much less to my clients. And when I asked them about that later, all of them said, well, I kind of liked it better when you didn't talk so much, which is a great lesson in the importance of listening with an open heart and with an aware mind in the most present way possible. Um, it helps you keep your balance. It helps you to monitor the flow of thoughts and feelings that are coming through your mind and that constitute the motivation for your behavior. So you have an opportunity observing those to be able to choose what you're going to do, to choose your action. And to
I
not to
lost your
act out
I
of habit.
lost your volume. I don't know if you don't look muted, but I'm not hearing what you're saying. Now I'm hearing you.
Okay. What I was saying is that kind of got sidetracked there for a moment. As you keep this sort of open-hearted attitude as you're listening to people, um, it keeps you centered and focused, and it allows you to observe the flow of thoughts and feelings in your mind so that you have an opportunity to choose your response to them, to choose your behavior. Rather than simply react, you can actually act in a positive way in the situation, which may be different from what your emotions are telling you. When anger arises in your mind, you have a chance to ask, okay, I'm angry. Is this going to be skillful in the situation? Is this going to help in some way? Is raising the volume going to actually help people to hear me? And most of the time, the answer is no. It gives you the chance to do something more effective and at the same time, generally more loving and more peaceful. Um, and so the cultivation of that kind of mindfulness, I think, is terribly important. I was listening to a very interesting interview this morning with a woman who's just written a book on power and how much women misunderstand what power means.
Mm.
And it's one of the first females discussing power that doesn't just go at the idea of power from a masculine perspective. And this woman trained as a Taoist nun, which is lovely.
Mm-hmm.
She also trained as a dominatrix.
Oh wow.
She also she earned the money and she gained the preliminaries for entering into a monastic life in Taoism as a dominatrix in New York City, which gave her a whole different idea of what power is. And the thing that she said more than anything else is that focused attention creates power in an interaction with people. And Swami Veda always used to say, the calmest person in the room is in control, no matter what's happening. And as I watch carefully the interactions between people, I see the truth of it. The person who can, and same thing for martial arts, keeping your center and your ability to observe very acutely what's going on around you and with the other person you're engaged with is what allows you eventually the intuition to know what somebody is going to do before they do it. In other words, in yoga we would say it turns on your buddhi, your ability to see and your ability to sense in a finer way, to have an intuition that goes beyond just the information you're getting from your senses. And I think that's a real antidote to a lot of the problems that we're having these days. It's just cultivating that sense of mindful awareness.
I know that mindful awareness has definitely helped me in my life to the degree of a lot of what you're saying, to listen more. And I know that your name is Stoma, but also I feel like I talk a lot of the time, and and the more I meditate, the more that gets reduced to a degree that it's significant, that it's noticeable around other people, and that it's noticeable to me, so that I don't react to my emotions, I don't react to the external events, and I act with intention towards a specific goal that tends to be in what I believe benefit to me and the people around me. A lot of the time led by intuition, a lot of the time not. And never ending um, spiritual practice, I guess.
Mhm.
Well,
In a way, I think that's almost a definition of profession, is to be able to use a field of knowledge with that kind of mindful awareness and intuition. I look back into all of these thoughts about how to reform policing, and one of the things that gets under my skin is the latitude that's given to police to escape consequences based on being in fear of their lives. And I don't know, to some people, this may seem unnecessarily harsh, but what is a law enforcement professional doing being in fear for their life? Have they not gotten some skills to manage their own fear internally? Well, the answer is generally no. You know, they manage their fear with external things, with weapons and sticks and armor and all this crap that the military keeps giving police forces. It's ridiculous. The real important protection that they have for everybody in the interaction that police has with the public is their ability to keep their balance emotionally in a situation. That's the really important part. And that's the part that makes law enforcement a profession, I think, is the ability to deal with your fear. Um, just like in psychotherapy, an ability to deal with hearing very difficult stuff about people's lives is a preparation for really being able to listen in a way that's useful to people as you learn to be a psychotherapist. Um, and that point seems to be entirely missed in this whole discussion that we're having in society these days. I don't agree that law enforcement people should have this latitude to get off from episodes of misbehavior based on I was afraid for my life.
I agree. I think it's kind of, I don't know if I'm going to do a just analogy, but it, uh, physicians are held to a very rigorous standard when
Mhm.
taking care of the life of others, and being afraid of doing a very difficult procedure or
Right.
health, it's just not part of the question. You need to do the best you can, and the tools to make that happen may or may not be given, but this is what needs to happen, and that causes a lot of anxiety. and other times it helps people look for strategies in which how to cope with these standards as well as to do a good job. And for me the answer has been mindfulness, amongst other things. Been thoughtful about a lot of what I do. I was just, prior to talking with you, I was listening to a conversation regarding an interview with a journalist from the Washington Post talking a lot about the these concentration camps going on in China, and the whole geopolitical infrastructure, and how several corporations are that sell products here are kind of trapped there, financially, in order, or feel trapped financially in order to maintain prices, and at the same time they have to subsequently um, be a buffer between different types of governments, which has led me to think for myself, okay, how can I be at peace of, so that my financial uh, resources are not funneled in a way that causes harm. And it's leading me to really question what it is that I buy, and just being more mindful, even deeper, to a degree, not only to what I eat, but for where is this project made from, what company is it making it, and what are the influences through which this company is acting on, etc.
And that's, that's going to be China's entry into world trade. And, once again, the West has been very naive about dealing with China, assuming that opening trade with China was going to somehow democratize them. Quite the opposite. They're managing to de-democratize the rest of the world. And they're so good at doing this. I mean, they get countries hooked into all of these, financial agreements that can sooner or later come to grief, or trying to take over the whole flow of world trade through their Belt and Road Initiative. Um, it's they're making they're doing a very skillful job of sort of putting the autocratic method out there as an alternative governance to people, and unfortunately, people are a little too inclined to listen to it at this point.
Yeah, it's scary.
What happens?
Um, anyway, this has been interesting so far.
I had no idea it was going where it went, but that's always the case. I mean, that's my, when I'm asked to do programs these days, I just really don't plan much. Um, I wait until I see the people sitting in front of me.
Oh, I'm
Whether it's
listening
on
again. Your
first.
volume. I don't know why that is happening.
Oh, the audio cut out again.
Yeah, I'm not listening. I'm not. I don't hear anything coming.
No, I'm
I don't
still.
know if it's me. Let's see, change it. Could you speak again?
Yeah, there. Can you
Now
hear me
it's,
now?
yeah.
Um, where were we? This
You
keeps throwing
sorry.
us
Yeah,
off.
you were saying that basically you don't plan for the talks
Right.
do these things.
And when I mean, actually, it's a great example of what we were talking about earlier. If I put my attention on the people in front of me, then the right stuff will flow out of me for the presentation. And, people will feel attended to and loved in the process of doing it. And watching that happen, watching that process occur, and the wonder of it is really what keeps me teaching these days. You know, it's not about much else at this point. Um,
I remember a conference in which, from the Himalayan tradition, that was given in Minneapolis. I think it was a teacher training program. And I remember, I don't remember which specific talk it was, but I remember that there was this person that was didn't really say much, and it would really pay attention to what you were saying. no matter what it was. And at some point, someone else during a talk alluded to him, and they really did say attention is love, and I really agree with that. And I should remind myself that more often, because it's so true. I definitely feel your attention, and I definitely feel your engagement, which leads me to be more engaged, and so on and so forth, creating probably an upward spiral in terms of the type of conversations that we will be having.
And this goes into the spiritual relationships I have with people that I'm guiding. Um, in some instances, it allows us a degree of love that is just so wonderful. Um, there's one person in Taiwan, for example, a very, very close student of mine, um, someone who I actually think of as a son. And if I just turn my mind in his direction, I can feel his life from inside his skin. I know how he's doing. Not details. I mean, but I can tell the general feeling of his life from inside his being. Um, and when we talk over the computer, which we do about every week, our conversation ends by just sort of trailing off into silence, and we just sit there and look at each other for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and just feel this sense of communion that is really something. And I think finding that kind of love with people is what we're all after, really. Whether we're talking about marriages or families or communities, that's really the most important thing. And you hear people who've been through near-death experiences uniformly to a person come back with this conviction that love is the only thing that matters anywhere for any reason. you know, the rest of it is completely optional. But love is the one thing that really counts. And I think that's absolutely true.
And thinking about thinking about love, and its never ending increase intensity, could we talk about approximations to love, I guess, like
Sure.
our increasing openness towards it, and how I recently started thinking about it almost as in terms of like the more one opens to love, the more happier one is, but the action of opening oneself to love is one of letting go of prior concepts and understandings and ideas of oneself and the world in which we relate to each other, which can be pretty scary, I would say, in greater degrees, maybe not
Yeah.
so much so in shorter degrees. What are your thoughts about
I'm actually going to give you a neuroscientific explanation of this.
that?
And I'm not intending to sort of throw a lot of water on beauty with science. I think this is one of the beautiful things that science can sort of explain is that our ideas about what love is and what it should be, our expectations of it, are mental habits, conditionings, and those are maintained in this complex of structures along the midline of the cortex that we call the default mode network. And that's where all of your habits and conditionings, all the critical voices in your head, all that crap is in the default mode network, which is basically your brain on autopilot when you're not paying specific attention to something. And there's this conversation that goes on constantly between the default mode network and the medial prefrontal cortex when you are paying attention. And so when you become mindfully aware, the default mode network goes into the background. And this whole system run by the medial prefrontal cortex begins to reorganize what's in the default mode network, albeit not real fast. Um, but it does happen. And so I think what we're feeling in those moments when we drop into this expanded sense of openness with somebody, we feel a sense of vulnerability because our habits are suspended. Our habitual ways of responding, even to danger, are turned off. And we're just allowing something to arise in our experience de novo. And so often that sense of vulnerability in those moments are something people are conditioned to feel afraid of. But the more you pay attention and the more you keep yourself mindfully aware, the more those things become sources of wonder in your life. You know, Yogananda, the great yogi from California, talking about his experience of the highest meditation and samadhi, describes it as endless waves of ever new joy. And I took a careful look at that phrase when I was working on this book that I wrote a couple years ago, Clearing the Path. Um, thank you. um, I took a careful look at that phrase because all of a sudden I realized, I mean, this is joyfulness that never becomes familiar. It never becomes the usual thing. It's always got this sense of newness and freshness, innocence. It is the experience of the garden. It's what's meant by the Garden of Eden metaphor in Christian tradition. That's what the Garden of Eden is. And Yogananda would say in his Bible commentary, he would say that, you know, the task of yoga and meditation is to bring human beings back to the garden, back to a point where they are not controlled simply by habits, but by this sense of openness to everything at every moment. And, you know, some spiritual figures even refer to this as being basically a permanent orgasm. And I think I actually think this is good language to use because it gets the point across that when the philosophers in India talk about ananda, about the joy that is characteristic of the highest reality of Brahman, we're not talking about just sort of happy days. I mean, we're talking about a sort of joy that completely explodes your experience of the world into an eternal present where there actually is no past and no future. It's always present. And in our habit bound state of mind, which we live in 99+% of the time, we have only future and past. We don't really taste the present. People give a lot of lip service to the present moment, but the only place you know the present moment is in samadhi, in the highest meditation. That's the only place. And at that point, that's really something. There's a great yogi who was the last identified master of the Kashmir Shaiva tradition. His name is Lakshman Ju. He left the body in 1995. And he was the people who taught he was the person who taught most of the current great scholars and practitioners of that tradition. He did some interviews on video that are available on YouTube. And there's one of them called The Final Goal of Yoga, where he's talking about this aspect of what the final goal is. And he actually says, you know, it's basically a permanent orgasm. Uh, he says it's a super sexual experience, um, something that is beyond anything you can do with your body mind. Um, and I think that's the way to understand what the goal is to be that kind of joyful person. Um, and in between where we are now and that goal is this gradient that we climb of gradually becoming more and more joyful, more and more happy, not in a self-satisfied or complacent way, but just in that sense of openness and wonder to things. And in that way, I mean, this is what Christ meant when he talked about becoming like a little child in order to enter the kingdom. Whenever Jesus talks about the kingdom, substitute the word samadhi. And
Oh, I lost your volume again.
if you look at what Jesus told his disciples, he said, um, "Only as you become like a child may you enter the kingdom of heaven." And this is what he's referring to: this gradual growth and cultivation of a sense of mindful awareness that brings with it open-heartedness, compassion, joyfulness, joyful mindedness. These qualities that the yogis talk about, yogis and Buddhist meditators as well talk about them in exactly the same terms. Maitri, or metta in Pali, friendliness; karuna, compassion; mudita, joyful mindedness; and upeksha, or upekka in Pali, emotional non-reactivity, emotional stability, groundedness, centeredness, focus. So these are all things that grow in us as we make progress. There are also things you can practice. In the Buddhist tradition, they approach these as practices. I think the one that most people would have some familiarity with is the metta meditations that are done by a lot of Buddhist practitioners, of broadcasting this sense of loving kindness out to all beings, starting from yourself. And that's one way of cultivating this attitude. The phrase, you know, perpetrate acts of random kindness and senseless beauty. Wonderful. That's exactly the sort of thing that we're talking about. And the more you fill your life with that, the more you grow. And the basis, the foundation for all of that is cultivating the sense of moment to moment mindfulness. So I don't put, at this late point in my life, I don't put so much emphasis on my sitting meditation time, although that's still important. But I'm much more concerned with, where is my mind during the day? Where is my mind as I'm talking to you? And as I talk to you and I watch you, how much can I feel your heart in my own? That's what really matters to me.
Sounds very beautiful, and I think that one thing that I love about what we're talking about right now is the potential applicability of everything that you're saying. And I love that I'm recording this conversation, because I feel like I'm going to listen to it in the future again. and and what would you say to the idea of this solitary yogi that goes to the cave to find enlightenment, and where, and in that person, where do they find this interrelatability, this using the relationship for their spiritual growth, and for, I call it spiritual growth, but it's like really expression of love, right? The expression of love,
Right.
and 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 growing through this love.
I talk about the ability to sense the lives of people I'm connected to at a distance. There are some people I can do this with. The great yogi in the cave has a much greater ability to do this and to affect the world through what they do inside themselves. Every once in a while, Swami Veda and Swami Rama would comment on the way in which those cave yogis affect what goes on in the world, and how much over the centuries they have contributed to helping human beings not blow themselves to bits. Um, so that's the work of the yogi in the cave. Through their ability to remain in touch with the whole of being from inside themselves, they also have a great power to impact what happens outside, because we all live in a single mind field. Mind is a field phenomenon. One of the things I really honor about Daniel Siegel's work at UCLA on neuroscience is that he has based it in relationship. He hasn't just talked about what goes on inside the blob of gray jello inside your skull as you grow and develop. What he's talking about is how do relationships change even the form of your nervous system as you grow in the world. And he's begun to shine a light on the way in which mind is not something that's encapsulated within an individual person. That aspect of how we think of our mind is illusory. Um, and meditation is what takes you into those deeper layers of the mind field that go beyond your individual embodied life at every one of the levels that yoga describes. So the entirety of universes within universes within universes all exist in one mind field called chitta in yoga. And our individual minds are just little waves on the surface of that ocean. And so the task is to sort of get below the wave and to feel more of the currents that flow in those depths. And those yogis in the caves are the ones who are capable of doing that. And by doing that, they pacify the rest of the world. We make an effort to do that in our tradition by sitting for meditation as we did yesterday during the full moon. There are 4 different times at different places around the world that people sit together during the full moon day in order to create a meditative field of peacefulness, to try to contribute something constructive to the way the world is going at the moment, which is we need more. um, but that's what they do. It really isn't a selfish thing that they're doing. Um, I'm reminded of the story of Swami Rama's guru, one of these great realized yogis who sat in samadhi all the time in his cave. And as his disciple, Swamiji's job was to guard the entrance and make sure nobody got in. So one day, this prince comes along who wants to visit the guru, somehow found out he was there, and demands to see him. And Swamiji says no. And they kind of get into a fight about the whole thing and finally end up making enough noise that all of a sudden, from inside the cave, the master says, "Let him come in." So the prince comes in, presents his gifts, sits down, and begins the conversation by saying, "You sit here in this cave all alone all the time. Don't you ever get lonely?" And the yogi said, "Up until a moment ago, I was sitting with my friend. Now you have come, and I'm lonely. Your external presence cuts me off from my internal friend, which is a universe within a universe within a universe." Um, it was his way of saying, it actually hurts that you're sitting there talking to me. And of course, the prince didn't get it, and they had a brief conversation, and then the prince went away. But I mean, I think it gives a sense of the flavor of what they're doing up there in the caves. It's not just about learning practices or all of that. It's really for those, especially who have attained. It's about maintaining the world by maintaining this loving mind field.
That reminds me of there's this book Yogananda wrote. I forget which one it was, but he briefly mentions that one of the things he was doing one day back in the 40s in the middle of his meditation was to alter or implant a thought in Hitler's mind where he would think that invading Russia was a good idea in the winter. Yeah. Um, what are your thoughts about, you know, I I love meditation. I love yoga philosophy. I think it has changed my life and it will continue to do so. And I profoundly base a lot of its yamas and niyamas in my daily practice, and I found that to be so helpful. And there are different traditions, and one of the traditions I or around which I was born in South America and Ecuador is the shamanistic tradition that uses medicine plants for spiritual purposes, ayahuasca ceremonies, peyote ceremonies, psychedelic mushroom ceremonies, etc. And some of these substances are now being studied for mental illness, quote unquote, and
Right.
specifically for the use of major depressive disorder or existential distress in the terminally ill cancer patients, for substance use disorders. And and when you talk to a shaman, they would say that they really help you get in touch with the what they would call the great spirit, and then through that experience, you and through that connection, you learn how to act outside of that experience in order to eventually potentially have that experience on your daily life. And I just wonder what your thoughts are about that, this whole tradition.
Well, these things existed in the yoga tradition as well. In the first verse of the fourth part of the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali talks about how you can attain samadhi through birth, through uh, herbs, and lists several other things.
Hmm.
And I'm just curious enough about what it actually says to actually look it up. Of course, there's an app for that.
Oh, there is. What's the name?
Oh, yeah. I have a Yoga Sutras app so I can quickly look things up when I want to. Now I just have to find where I put it. There we go. Okay. Birth. Yeah. Birth, herbs, mantra, and practices of tapas. So birth refers to the impact of karma, to being born with a strong karmic momentum towards spiritual practice. Mantras we know. Tapas is practices of austerity, which, as you understand from reading the book, is really, it's not about self-denial. It's about learning to enjoy your life through concentration and gradually reducing your appetites in that way. And then you have um, oshadi is the Sanskrit word, and the way that the traditional medicine of India approaches herbs, uh, it's kind of interesting. In India, you have two systems of Ayurveda. You have the traditional ones who are trained in their families, the traditional Vaidyas, and then you have the academically trained Vaidyas who are trained in academic medical schools. And they tend to take a sort of a westernized perspective on looking at drugs in terms of active chemical ingredients, the way that we would in the West.
Mhm.
But the traditional Vaidyas have a very different view, and that herb is not just the vehicle for a certain chemical agent. It is a whole relationship of a being that is a plant with the whole rhythm of the universe. So when a traditional Vaidya goes out to gather herbs to use in their practice, they gather the herbs at a specific time during the year in a particular phase of the moon, according to how the energetics, the subtle aspects of the herb work, in addition to whatever may be there chemically. And that whole part gets completely left out often when we pull these traditional cultural methodologies into a scientific context. Um, and that's a problem. It's a problem of cultural misappropriation, but it's also a problem of missing the point often. Um, and So I think that's one aspect of the relationship between the traditional practices and what's going on in research on psychedelics these days. Now, I think the research on psychedelics is certainly a good thing. I mean, just the fact that the approval of MDMA for depression has come through is just a wonderful contribution for people who have, those forms of depression that just seem to be refractory to all the other uh, medicinal kinds of interventions. For those people to be able to feel some relief from that in minutes is just, I mean, I can't imagine how much hope that would give somebody who is, living in that suicidal shadow.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that aspect of it is really important. And I'm glad that the research is being undertaken now under better controls than it was in the 1960s. Hopefully
Absolutely.
people will keep their hands out of out of the clinical material.
Yeah, it's so
But
exciting.
I think these things are important contributions. Now, in terms of um, what they do is, in a way, it's similar to what the yogis do when they give somebody Shaktipatha, or I should say, when Shaktipatha flows through a guru into a student. It raises their mind up temporarily. It gives them a glimpse of something so that they know what to shoot for. And then the task is to be able to do it without the assist. Of course, the problem is too many people hang on to the shortcut. I have one therapy client I've been talking to periodically over the years who just cannot give up his psychedelic shortcut. Um, and we keep having arguments about this.
Would
But for example, in my own life, I took a vow of celibacy in 2007. And, that's a struggle for anybody to do. I mean, that's really hard. And as Swami Veda told me once earlier in my life, when I somehow expressed the idea that sexual urges become less um, immediate with age, he said, forget that. That's going to be with you into your 80s, honey. You better deal with it. Um, and for a long time, I mean, he talks about how he can't imagine why people settle for a 7-second thrill. So, my question has always been, what is the state of mind of a genuinely celibate person that makes ordinary human sexuality seem so small? I struggled for a long time to have a positive relationship with my own sexuality in general and also as a gay man. And having worked that hard to get to that place, I was not so enthusiastic about giving it up. It's something that I earned very dearly in life. And so for a long time, I asked my gurus for some kind of a clue. What am I shooting for? What should I be looking to bring to birth in my personality? So one day in 2013, I was sitting in my cottage at Sadagram, and all of a sudden in my meditation, I found myself in this space of almost, the way I described it was an almost painful feeling of delight, a sense of joy that was so strong and so intense that it felt like it would physically burn me up if I stayed there longer than 3 or 4 minutes. I wrote him about this and I described my feeling, and I said in what I wrote to him, it felt like an orgasm, but no physical stimulation, no outward arousal. And he wrote back to me he wrote back a nice note, and the last line in his note was, "And I live in that orgasmic state most of the time." And I thought, how is that even possible? I would have burned up. I mean, I could hardly imagine that as a steady state way of being in the world. But it gave me a glimpse. And now I recognize, for example, in some of these relationships that I'm talking about with some of the students, where that love has grown so deep between the two of us that I can feel their life from inside their skin. You know, these people have really given me their heart. Why would I need to get into their body? That doesn't make any rational sense. Um, and so watching that grow in you is the path towards celibacy, whether you have sex or not. Celibacy is not about whether you have sex or not, even though everybody wants to make it about that. Having sex in a mindful way is a practice of celibacy. And again, very few people do it that way. It's so habit bound. There's a sex researcher named Richard Schnarch. Interesting name, where that comes from. But Schnarch has done a lot of work on how couples interact in sexual interaction. And one of the things he discovered is that almost nobody looks their partner in their eyes when they come. Can you? I mean, I can't imagine that. For me, that's a really important part of the experience. I can't imagine anybody not doing that. But the vast majority of people, and I mean like 95%, find that too vulnerable. And they turn away and they experience everything internally. And they go, right into their default mode network for all of their conditionings about what sex is supposed to be. If you roll it the other way and you roll it into an open hearted, mindful experience of sexuality, then it starts to grow way beyond the individual person. And that's where people begin to find this link between sexuality and spirituality. And I think, frankly, that's what the gift of our sexuality is for. That's its purpose. For so many people who don't live a meditative life, a great sexual experience is the first thing that starts to open their mind towards spirituality. And it's where a lot of people's spiritual seeking begins. So, I mean, even in terms of how you relate to people as a physician, not that you should be in bed with your patients, but the most important thing you give your patients as a physician is your attention. Is the relationship that you have to offer. And I've had this sense of grief for a long time for the field of psychiatry because biological psychiatry has made the day-to-day work of psychiatry, seeing people 5 minutes at a time and writing scripts out all the time. And that is so unsatisfying, no one wants to do it anymore. And so that now they're trying to sort of download it onto psychologists. And my profession is seeking to become prescribing physicians. And I just think that's the biggest mistake the APA has ever made. And it's actually the reason I left the organization. I think it's just beyond stupid to do that because, what we legitimately have to give people is relationship as a healing instrument in therapy in the same way that you have that as a physician. And we get so oversubscribed to physical ways of looking at what works that, we don't pay attention to how important the heart of the physician is. It's a little bit like sleep. A few years ago, I got invited to give a presentation on yoga nidra at a sleep conference. So I figured I better learn something about sleep science. So I took a course in sleep science. And my God, I had no idea. I had no idea that sleep was the best medicine for absolutely everything, Even if you measure the effect sizes compared to the research for all the surgeries and all the medications and everything, nothing beats sleep. Unbelievable. Who knew? Like everybody should have known. And I think the same thing's true of the relationship in among physicians. And I hope that all of these healing professions pay more attention to that interpersonal field of neuroscience and the way that it impacts our professional work, because it's such a big deal. Chopra tells this really moving story about a woman who came to see him because she had terrible abdominal pain, and he did a physical exam because he's a internal medicine. I think he's an internal medicine doctor. And his conclusion from the findings in the exam was probably had cholecystitis. So sent the lady. He sent the lady to a general surgeon. They booked her for surgery and did the surgery. And of course, when they opened her abdomen, they discovered cancer everywhere. So they just closed her up and gave her a prognosis of days, actually 5 or 6 days to live. So in the recovery room, she's beginning to wake up, and Chopra is there, and he has this sudden intuition to couch his feedback to her in a particular way. And he says, um, he said it wasn't your gallbladder. That's all he said.
Hmm.
There was no problem with your gallbladder. And so they parted company, and he just sort of assumed that she would pass away quietly in the next few days, and that would be that. But she didn't. She shows up in the hospital a month later looking pretty good. So Chopra took her aside and just asked her, how have you been since your surgery? And she said, well, it's really interesting because the day I came in with all that belly pain, I didn't say it, but I was afraid I was full of cancer. And, Chopra's interpretation of this is that somehow she sort of managed to reach into the depths of her mind field at a quantum level to create this incredible disappearance of her cancer. They did all the tests over again. There wasn't any cancer in her at all. She had a total remission of all the different forms of cancer that were there. And nobody can explain this sort of thing except this was in the story actually comes from a book by this quantum physicist named Amit Goswami called The Quantum Doctor, which is he uses quantum physics as a way to create a theoretical system where allopathic medicine, Ayurveda, homeopathy, and all these other systems can kind of work together rather than fighting with each other all the time because they work at different levels of the mind field.
What's the name of this book again?
It's called The Quantum Doctor. I loved it. It was a neat book. And Goswami is a really cool guy. He is one of the people who appeared in that film, What the Bleep, a few years ago. And he devoted his career to trying to popularize ideas about quantum physics in the culture because he realized that these ideas were not disseminating. And I saw this when I started my psychology training in the 1980s. Why is nobody talking about this stuff? It changes everything about how we think about how the world works. And so Goswami has written a whole series of books about different aspects of this to try to introduce quantum ideas to the general public. And I think it's a real important service, not only to the general public, but also to science, because, scientists have been just as bloody minded as anybody else about taking that stuff in. Einstein referred to quantum non-locality as spooky action at a distance, is something that was just basically a superstition, and he turns out to be totally wrong about that.
So interesting. Like when you mention all these things, the Quantum Doctor and that book and all these fantastic anecdotal instances of patients or people getting cured immediately. for unknown reasons. It I feel like the psychology of a typical physician is to learn as much as they can and trying to explain everything that they can through the science that they have, and everything else is probably wrong, right? Like in
Well,
it's
it
it's
can
hard.
be wrong. Often it's helpful. The point is to not be a fundamentalist about it, I think. You know, this there's this physician, the guy who used to run the physical medicine clinic at NYU, blocking his name right now, but I mentioned him in the book on the part on dealing with back pain. I mean, he recognized that almost all low back pain is totally psychosomatic. It has absolutely nothing to do with ruptured discs. And subsequently, research has proved him to be correct. And it changed the whole way we look at pain management now. Um, and, so not letting that become fundamentalistic, I think, is really important. And being open to the fact that there's always something more. Medicine is an art. It really is an art. It's not just a technology. And the best doctors have always been great relational artists with people. And a good part of the healing comes from the relationship. And I hope more of that gets back into medicine. Um, I think of the wonderful sense of humanity that Oliver Sacks had about his neurological patients. My God, and how carefully he listened to them. He must have, they must have felt so loved by him. Um, and I was also thinking about this guy, Richard Seltzer, who used to be the head chief of surgery at Yale. He wrote a couple of books in the 1970s, one of which the title was Notes on the Art of Surgery, where he talked about his experiences with things that went beyond what medicine could explain. And included in these is a story about when the Dalai Lama's physician came in a diagnostic contest with the whole medical machine at Yale. They took a woman who was going to be diagnosed for some kind of cardiac problem, and the allopathic doctors put her through all the heart cath and everything else. The Tibetan doctor asked for a fresh sample of urine, which he put in a wooden bowl and whisked before he just spent 45 minutes smelling it.
Hmm.
And then he palpated the woman's pulse for an hour. So the Western doctors come back with their diagnosis, ventricular septal defect. The Tibetan doctor says, in the cave where the winds of this woman's vital air blow, between two of the walls, there's a hole.
Hmm.
Same diagnosis. Gained mostly by attention and intuition. So these books are really fun, and I think they kind of keep your mind open to the fact that there's always something more. Unfortunately, I have to get off here because I've got a pool appointment in 22 minutes, so I better get my
Got it.
butt to the
One
car.
final question before we go. I see that you're dressed in red, and normally I see you dressed in yellow. Does this mean that you are a Swami right now?
No, not really, but I like the color.
Oh, okay.
And in our tradition, it's an alternative to the official yellow and orange colors of the vanaprasthis and the sannyasis. And I look much better in burgundy than I do in either of those others. So
I really appreciate your time, Stomaji. It was lovely talking with you, and I re- I'm just like feeling how much I love talking to you, and just thank you.
look,
Thank
Christian,
you.
we can talk anytime. Just drop me a note.
Will do.
All right.
Take care.
Take care of yourself.
You too. Bye.
I might end up being in Washington. I've been working with some people at the Sri Shiva Vishnu Temple in Maryland.
Okay.
They have a foundation that's doing some applications of meditative stuff to things like stress management for hospital groups, police, those kind of people. So I've been doing some work with them. Plus, I have my nephew Tyler or Dylan Parker was just accepted into a PhD program in trumpet performance at Peabody at Johns Hopkins.
Oh, great.
So the chances are pretty good that I'll pay him a visit sometime when I'm in Washington. So I'll let you know when I'm coming.
Yeah, please do. I'll take the trek there.
Okay. Take care.
You too. Bye.